you've done some research in cross-modal recruitment and
Mhm,
reorganization.
mhm,
How does that occur? Is that
mhm,
something that naturally occurs at a certain level, and then we see it occurring more with different types of sensory impairment, or
mhm,
in people not having access to certain senses, you see more of that cross-modal functionality?
mhm. That's a great question. So it depends on when the sensory loss occurs. If a child is born without hearing, we call that congenital deafness, profound deafness. We start hearing in the womb. So they don't have a hearing loss at birth. They've had a hearing loss of several months in the womb as well, which we also think affects how the brain begins to develop. But that's a very difficult thing to test, as you can imagine. But for a child who hasn't heard, the cortex of the auditory system is not going to have received stimulation or input. And so instead of letting those neurons or that network go unused and completely prune it away, visual neurons in that same area will start to recruit and take over that area to help in processing. And we showed this in a study looking at children who received cochlear implants, and they had activation in the auditory cortex when they watched a visual stimulus, whereas children with normal hearing didn't. They only had activation in the visual cortex. And so we do believe that is a compensatory mechanism to help process sound related communication, but visually. So things like lip reading, being able to orient yourself very quickly to different spatial locations. One of the best studies on visual cross-modal recruitment was done by Steve Lomber and colleagues. And what they did was they had deaf cats and they had them do a visual task. And it was basically peripheral localization. Okay. And so the deaf cats, compared to hearing cats, were able to localize at the extreme periphery much better. All right. Than the hearing cats could. And so the theory was maybe they had recruited parts of auditory cortex to provide this enhanced visual behavior. But to test that, they needed to be able to deactivate the auditory cortex somehow. So they implanted these cooling loops that would cool the auditory cortex without harming it, and it would be deactivated. And so then they re-presented this visual task, and they found that the peripheral enhancement went away. Okay, when they deactivated auditory cortex. When they let it warm back up again and redid the visual task again a third time, that enhancement returned. And so, as you can imagine, for survival, if we go back to that kind of primitive question, if you can't hear, your visual system needs to be on high alert for processing purposes to alert you to danger. And so that's in the case of, a developing brain. If you've heard throughout your life and you have those networks established and then you lose your hearing, we still see evidence of visual activation of auditory cortex. We still see that, but it's most likely a different mechanism. We think it might be something called unmasking of visual networks that are already in auditory cortex. And so they'll kind of rise to the occasion. But we also see that reverse or is reversible with hearing aids and sometimes cochlear implants. And so you can do pre and post studies where you look at, is recruitment present, i.e., is auditory cortex responding to visual input? And then you can fit a hearing aid or a cochlear implant and then redo the task a few months later, and it might go away. So we do think it's more of a different mechanism than a hardwired mechanism that might take place early in development with sensory deprivation.
It's very interesting.